At Renaissance, our products work together to support continuous learning inside and outside the classroom. Accurately assess with STAR assessments. Reach new literacy goals with Accelerated Reader. Provide 24/7 access to authentic texts with MyOn. Differentiate instruction with Freckle. Uncover learning loss and equity issues with Schoolzilla. Celebrate with a complete picture of student performance. We support the learner, wherever they're learning, in a whole new way.
So today, our final presentation is coming from Emma, and she's going to teach us about what she learned. Can we get a round of applause for Emma?
Hello everyone. My presentation today is how our school uniforms are made.
You can't put words to how important kids are.
Dennis Uniform was founded in 1920.
You want their lives to be full of love. You want them to be smart and successful and confident. It's my job as a teacher to make it all happen, and I do it every day as best I possibly can. But still, you try to think of every little detail. They're worth it. After a while, you forget that you're their teacher. You become like a parent, and they become your family.
Good morning and welcome to this NCEA 2021 live session entitled Teens, When You Get Them, You've Got Them. Our presenter this morning will be Terrence Houlihan. We invite you to actively engage with this presentation using the messaging and questions function in the event platform. At the conclusion of the session, you will have the opportunity to complete a post-session evaluation and provide feedback that will also track your participation in our sessions. If you run into any problems, we invite you to refresh your screen or use the help section on the event platform. Now, Terrence, thank you for being with us here at NCEA 2021, and we turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sterling. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Actually, where I am, it's good afternoon. It is a beautiful day here in New York. I'm in New Rochelle, just outside of New York City. So welcome to the session known as Teens. When you get them, you've got them. So before we get started, I'd like to go into the title for a second. And I think many of us in education, and some of us might actually also be parents of young ones or teenagers. So, for us as educators and parents, we might spend some time during our kids' adolescent years becoming worried about essentially losing them. And there might be some truth into the losing them idea. Definitely the relationship with kids as they move through different developmental stages changes. But I think sometimes some of us come from this place of fear that we're going to lose teenagers to technology, that we're going to lose them to drugs and alcohol, that we're going to lose them to boyfriends and girlfriends, we're going to lose them to risk-taking, to gangs, so on and so forth. And what I have found being in education for over now 25 years is that many times teens feel like we as adults really don't understand them. And to some degree or another, we don't. I mean, every single one of us who's on this session has been a teenager, but none of us has been a teenager right now. No one has been through their high school years in the midst of a pandemic, hybrid learning, remote learning. So to a large degree, we don't understand what it is that they're going through. And what I would like to do with you over the next 45 minutes or so is teach you ways to sort of get them. Because when adolescents feel like you get them, you've got them. They're going to stick with you. All right, so let's get started. First and foremost, I think it's important to highlight that for those of us who are parents, or for those of us who worked with young kids, in many ways we've been viewed as goddesses or gods. They look at us as if we hold all the power in our hands, and to some degree or another, we do. Something really interesting happens, though, when they become teenagers. They tend to do something with their eyes. And this sends parents and teachers into a tailspin when we get the eye roll. And now for myself as a parent, my son is well into his late 20s, he's married, lives in Manhattan. So I've kind of been through this. And, my wife is also a counselor as well. So I think we kind of messed our son up. He would come home from school and we'd be like, how was your day? And he'd say, of course, fine, as they all do. And we're like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that he's freaked out, insecure, neurotic, and emotional? Or does that mean that he doesn't want to talk to us? So nonetheless, this is essentially one of the things that I enjoyed doing as a parent was going into my son's room on a Saturday morning and watching him sleep, because Dylan had a tremendous amount of energy when he would wake up. And what we would do on Saturday mornings is we would actually watch the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner show. I may be sort of dating myself. And of course, we would go into, sugar overload by having multiple bowls of Fruit Loops. But something really interesting happened to Dylan as he aged. His bedroom turned into something completely different. And this is, for some of you, this is what your students are doing 5 minutes before you log on to Google Meets or Zoom, or actually, if the bus is outside. What we know from the research is that the adolescent sleep clock gets pushed back by approximately 2 to 3 hours. So as young ones, they might have been getting tired and going to sleep, between 9 and 10. Now they're not really getting sleepy until like 11 or 12. And of course, you put this into the mix and they're up quite later. So what I want to explain to you about this is something that neuroscientists have identified, is that there is a sort of biological sleep clock. It's right in the center of our brain. It's in one of the most powerful organs in the human body called the hypothalamus. And in the center of the hypothalamus is a grouping of cells called suprachiasmatic nuclei, or the SCN. And this is what essentially releases melatonin. That's what gets us sleepy. But something really interesting happens when kids enter puberty and estrogen levels get to a certain point and testosterone levels get to a certain point. They sort of marinate in that area of the brain, and it delays the release of melatonin. So for many of them, it's not really a choice for them to stay up late. Obviously, if they're on their phones or on their TVs, there's that light that comes in that delays the release of melatonin. But a lot of schools have actually heeded this research and delayed start times. So, the session is going to be a mix of a lot of details about neuroscience and how to apply it into the classroom and relationships with our students. All right, so the other thing too is that in addition to being the director of a K-12 counseling program, I'm also an adjunct lecturer at the City University of New York, and I can actually have access to brain scans. So this first image here, what you're seeing an actual 16-year-old brain through an fMRI, and all of the neural pathways have been lit up. So if you can see my cursor here, this is essentially what we're doing is we're looking down on this 16-year-old brain, and their brains do work. We can see it right here. This is the frontal lobe. Back here is the occipital lobe. If you look closely, you'll see some red lines horizontally. That's evidence of the corpus callosum. And underneath this area is an area of the brain that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. It's very active in teenagers. It's called the limbic system. So this scan was taken in about 2018, I believe. Recent scan was taken, which gives us a great view of what's going on in 16-year-old brains. And I'm going to show this one to you. This one comes from MIT. Okay, so a little bit of humor for you, because if you're working with teenagers, you definitely need to have a sense of humor. So some initial thoughts. I'm talking about a very large percentage. So whenever we talk about large percentages of people, of groups, there's always exceptions. You may think to yourself, well, my students don't do this, or my daughter doesn't do this, my son doesn't do this. Of course, there's always exceptions. And I think to some degree or another, we spend an awful lot of time talking about this particular young generation, the ones who are in the latter part of elementary school, middle school, high school, and early college. We're going to call them Gen Z. There are people are battling for the title, whether it be iGen or AppGen. But right now, it seems to be Generation Z. The generation before that are called the millennials. And it's, by the way, it's all their fault, the millennials. And before that is my generation, Generation X. And then we have the baby boomers. And then before the baby boomers, the silent generation. And then before them were the greatest generation. And, in my research, what I have found is that actually older generations always complain about younger generations. For example, you can look at descriptors of Elvis Presley, Jim Morrison, Justin Bieber, and just substitute their names. They all essentially say negative things about the younger generation. And most older generations will complain about the young generation. They are different. They do things differently. Many of them don't wear watches. They don't have to. They use their smartphones. Most of them don't use the phone to talk with people. They actually will text with people. So it's very, very different. They're not in a rush to get their licenses, but they're not the worst generation. In many ways, they're very different. And also, when talking about human behavior, I think to some degree we all long for a singular causation. We look for that one thing that creates the problem. So, for example, gun violence, there's camps that say, it's access to guns. That's the problem. There's another camp that says it's a mental illness issue. Another camp that says, well, it's a culture of violence. In many ways, it's a combination of things. We also know from the research that kids and teenagers have the capacity to be resilient. What's fascinating is when you look into resiliency studies, what you'll find is that one of the most common factors amongst people who've been able to develop resiliency is that they had one adult in their life during their childhood and teenage years who expressed interest in them. That might be you. You never know. Their chances for resiliency automatically double when they believe at least one adult cares about them. And in many ways, that's all that you need to do, is to just put forward that you care about them. The word anxiety has gotten a bad rap over the years. And I just want to put something out there. If a student is experiencing test anxiety, to some degree or another, it probably means that they want to do well on the test. Anxiety is not a bad thing. I'm going to feel anxious about going into a new situation because I oftentimes don't know much about it. However, there is no official diagnosis for test anxiety. We don't necessarily have anxiety. We all experience anxiety. Fear oftentimes can be a great motivator. It can be a great teacher. So one of the things that I like to do with students is sort of explore this, whatever it is that they're feeling. What do you think your fear is teaching you? And speaking about adolescence, we need to sort of identify what this term means. it's been around for hundreds of years, but the psychologist who popularized our understanding of adolescence lived around the same time as Sigmund Freud, G. Stanley Hall. And he wrote a 2-volume work called Adolescence, Part 1, Part 2. And he identified it as starting at 12, ending at about 18. And he described it as a period of great storm and stress. And I think to a large degree, we still operate from that perspective. We know now that adolescence probably starts a bit earlier because we have girls in lower socioeconomic communities who are starting puberty at 7.5. We have boys in lower socioeconomic communities starting puberty at age 9. So we're averaging it out at starting at about age 10 or so. And then it's ending probably around age 25 or so. I've done presentations all across the United States and even in other countries. And one of the funniest responses is when I ask the audience, when do you think adolescence ends? Somebody shouted, never, for men. A little bit of humor there again. So what we're going to talk about is that period of 10 to 25, but focusing on 2 specific areas, early adolescence and middle adolescence. So, people will oftentimes say it ends at about 25 because that's when the prefrontal cortex stops developing. That's up for debate, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So we're going to talk about 10 to 15 and 15 to 20. And at no other point in our lives will we go through as many internal changes and external changes. Let's just take a moment and think about it. So all of the changes that come as a result of puberty. And by the way, puberty does not start with the rise of testosterone and estrogen. Puberty actually starts with the rise of a neuropeptide known as kisspeptin. And kisspeptin will essentially identify it is now time to release estrogen levels. It's now time to release testosterone levels. So the neuropeptide kisspeptin responds to fat percentages within the body. And when we have a culture that focuses on sugar and high fructose corn syrup and simple carbohydrates that are not being burned off, that will turn into fat. So this is why I said earlier that girls in lower socioeconomic communities are starting puberty at such a young age because of the lack of access to healthy foods. Some people will refer to some of these densely populated urban areas as food deserts, that within a mile radius, there's no access to really healthy food. There's easy access to Wendy's and McDonald's and KFC, and those things are actually very, very cheap. The other thing, too, particularly with this generation, is all of the impacts as a result of COVID-19. So it's forced them to do remote learning. It's forced them to do hybrid learning. It's impacted them on a social level. It's impacted them on an academic level, but also very much on an existential level. Now, we can take a very pessimistic view of this and say, Gen Z is going to be messed up for a while. And there might be some truth to that, and we need to acknowledge that and figure out ways to address social emotional learning needs. We need to figure out ways to sort of, help kids to catch up academically. However, please keep this in mind. Every generation that reaches adulthood in some way, shape, or form has been impacted by their younger years, and it can be as a force for good. So if we think about the baby boomers, one of the things that they oftentimes were involved in were social causes. It's very possible that Gen Z might be one of the most transformational generations who reaches adulthood that we've seen in a long, long time. They may actually address the climate change crisis. They may actually turn healthcare into wellness. See, many of us approach going to the doctor as when we feel bad or something's off. There's this level of functioning, and when we're here, we go to the doctor just to get back here. Well, maybe Gen Z will actually look for ways to get us here, to functioning from a place of wellness. man, they are moving from elementary school to middle school to high school. And they hear from so many of us, you're not going to be able to do that in high school. You're not going to be able to do that in college. And all of the pressures that our culture has put on them in terms of college acceptances. I highly recommend this new Netflix documentary about the college admissions scandal. It's interesting, what exactly happened, but it also gives us a view of what we are doing to kids and young adults with all the emphasis on a name for college. Speaking of which, when you look at it, you have institutions that typically will receive maybe 20,000 applications. This past year, some of these colleges had to process 50,000 applications. So kids are getting pressure from their parents, from their teachers, from other adults. And speaking of parents, they are disconnecting from them. They're pulling back. I like to tell parents oftentimes that every time your child says no, it's a yes to a potential future self. Because now they're turning to their peer groups and they're experimenting with dating and romantic relationships. Folks, what we know from the brain research is that in the first 2 months of any new romantic relationship, someone's brain looks as if literally it's addicted to an opiate. Now you put that on a 15-year-old brain, and that's why they're texting their partners, 100 times in an hour because they haven't responded to the last one. They are using, abusing, and experimenting with illegal substances. There's an increase in sensation seeking, and a lot of that has to do with a neurotransmitter called dopamine, and I'll be speaking an awful lot about that. And then, of course, all of the demands of technology and media. Another documentary that I'm highly going to recommend to all of you is the documentary known as The Social Dilemma. Gives us some great insight into what's going on with Gen Z. And then, of course, at least in my state, New York State, at the age of 16, they can drive. Unfortunately, some scary statistics, according to the National Traffic and Safety Board. Once you put another teenager into the car of a teenager who's driving, the chances for a fatal accident double. Once you put a third teenager into a car, the chances for a fatal accident triple. And you know how to answer this, right? Once you put a fourth teenager in, yes, the chances for a fatal accident actually quadruple. It's very scary. All right, so look at all of those things and essentially put them together. Folks, this is what you get. That's you, that's them, that's their parents, that's everybody. Okay, a little bit on developmental theories. So some of you might remember the material that you covered in graduate school or even in your undergraduate studies on Jean Piaget and Sigmund Freud and Erickson and other ones. Essentially what they all said is kids go from this to that. So Piaget said, they go through 4 stages of development. That last stage, they've grown out of egocentricity, and now they're into, caring about others. Well, apparently Piaget didn't necessarily work that well with teenagers, because actually one of the most narcissistic animals on the planet is in fact a teenager. All right. And then we have Erickson, who popularized this idea of the identity crisis. And it was Erickson's own work with the Oglala Lakota Sioux when he realized that the depression rates were so high, that the alcoholism rates were so high amongst Native American populations, predominantly because white Europeans stole their land. We stole their identity. And Erickson went through this himself. Erickson was born Eric Hamburger, did not know he was adopted for a long time, but stood out like a sore thumb when he was growing up because he was tall, blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, grew up in a Jewish community. It wasn't until later that he found out he was adopted. Folks, he changed his name. Think about it. His first name is Eric, son of Eric, that he essentially parented himself. And it was that identity crisis stage that he identified that allowed him to expand to these 8 stages of development. So it's really, really important to see these kids in the context of individuating from their parents and becoming their own individuals. So, at parent-teacher conferences, when you might hear parents say, like, I don't know what happened to her. I don't know what happened to him. They went to bed. They were so nice. They loved me. And then they woke up and they won't talk to me. I can't believe I'm related to you. There are some very real cognitive distortions that go on for kids. So David Alkind in 1967 actually identified that what happens for them is that because of all of the internal changes and external changes that are going on for them, particularly with puberty, they're watching themselves. They begin to focus more and more on themselves and begin to think that other people are watching them. Alkind in the early 70s coined the phrase the imaginary audience. Now, you throw this in with Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, that's obviously going to increase. And what we've seen with teenagers, particularly younger girls, is that depression rates, anxiety rates, issues with self-esteem have risen quite a bit because of all of the focus on the development of self from social media. So again, multiplying this, if they are consumed with themselves, they might also begin to think that nobody could possibly understand them. It's almost like they turn into like these Shakespearean actors in a tragedy, and no one could possibly understand the depth of me. And it's important for us as adults to not tell them, I know what you're going through. Yes, as I said earlier, we were teenagers, but we don't know exactly what it is that they're going through right now. But what we can do is be curious. And I don't necessarily like to ask them direct questions in a classroom setting or even individually. What I like to do is say, well, tell me more about that. And when you seem interested to a 12-year-old, to a 17-year-old, and what they have to say, they'll start talking. But you got to be careful of your facial expressions. It was a really interesting experiment that came out of Harvard a few years back by Deborah Yurgel and Todd. And what she decided to do was to put teenagers into an fMRI and adults into an fMRI, a functional MRI machine that actually sees what's going on in the brain in real time. And she showed all of the experimentees 6 basic human expressions: fear, anger, sadness, happiness or joy, disgust, and surprise or shock. Okay, all the adults and all the teenagers were exposed to these 6 faces, and then they were shown a series of other faces, and they were asked to identify, hey, what do you see? What do you think is going on? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you another slide, and I'm going to ask you to yourselves to say aloud what emotion you see. Okay? Now, if you're a math teacher, you might say anger. No, just kidding there. But in reality, 50% of teenagers saw anger in that face. Anger. Yeah, let me go back. So let's look at anger. We have furrowed eyebrows, a crease here, and we see some teeth. Now, fear is raised eyebrows and teeth. They're not furrowed. Eyes are wide. Eyes are not glaring. Folks, that's fear. 100% of adults said this is the face of fear. But interestingly, when they looked at their brains, different parts of the brain were active. So what I'm going to ask all of you to do right now is to actually stand up. Just stand up with me. Actually, I've been standing the whole time. So if you're seated, just stand up for a second and put your 2 hands up. Hands out like this, and make fists and bring them together and pull them down in front of your chest. And folks, what you're essentially looking at is about the size of your brain. Now, when I do this activity with teenagers, they all kind of do this to see if it fits because they don't believe me. And I know that some of you have done that right now. You don't believe me, but that is about the size of the human brain. Now, to give you a perspective, if you raise your two pinkies, this is essentially the area that we're going to call the prefrontal cortex. It's just behind the forehead here. If you look at the screen where my cursor is going in the yellow, that's the prefrontal cortex. The other area that we're talking about is underneath this temporal lobe inside of the brain called the limbic system. Go back to your fists, open up to your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere. This area here where the palms meet is sort of like the limbic system. This is the emotional, motivational part of the brain. This is where memory is located. This area here, the prefrontal cortex, that's like executive functioning skills. Now, to address a couple of things, in Yurgel and Todd's experiment, what she saw was that the adults were using their prefrontal cortex to read facial expressions. What teens were using was their primitive, emotionally driven limbic systems. Okay, a couple of myths that I want to put out there to you. Now, with regards to this, some of you have heard that there are right brain people, that there are left brain people. Did you know that there's no empirical evidence to indicate that? We actually use both parts of our brain, except for those people who are born without certain hemispheres. Yes, there are people who are born with maybe one hemisphere, but one of the things that happens is that as time goes on, they begin to sort of incorporate other things that might take place in different hemispheres into that one hemisphere. The human brain, the human body will adapt. If you don't believe me, just look at how we have gotten through COVID-19. Think about a year ago where we were all at. How are we going to do this? We're doing it. Oh, it may not be pretty, but we're doing it. We have the capacity to adapt. We have the capacity to be resilient. The other thing, too, is that some of you probably heard that we only use 10% of this thing. That's completely false. We use almost all of our brain, but not at one time. It would probably overheat. And believe it or not, the time at which the brain might be most active is while we are dreaming. You know, if you look at sleep studies and the EEG readout, the electroencephalogram readout, what you'll see is that the brain seems to be very, very active during a REM state. Think about it, because you're actually creating all of these feelings, all of these experiences. And the other thing that I want to emphasize is that many of you have probably heard about visual learners and auditory learners and kinesthetic learners, and that you can take this survey to figure out, you know, what your preferred learning style is, and you should teach according to that, or you should study according to that. Not one single shred of evidence of that. No empirical studies. But you'll say, hey, Terry, wait a second. I'm a visual learner. I like to look at pictures. Well, who doesn't? The only people who aren't visual learners are the people who are born congenitally blind. The only people who are not auditory learners are people who are deaf. And the only people who aren't kinesthetic learners are people who are born without sense receptors. We all learn in a variety of ways, but the way in which information stays in the brain, gets processed appropriately in the brain, is emotionally through this area. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to ask you to recite the ABCs. And I bet you some of you just sang it. Because when you were a kid, you learned that, maybe in a safe atmosphere with music. And that's how you recall it. You recall it in the same fashion. This limbic system is incredibly powerful for all of us. We know that in teenagers, the prefrontal cortex is not yet fully developed. And because of that, kids actually and teenagers live in their limbic system. So these three areas that seem to be pretty important are the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. One of the reasons why I love this image is because it gives us an idea of, you know, how powerful it is. So if somebody smells the scent of an attacker, if they were in a violent episode years prior, that those odor molecules are going to go through the olfactory epithelium into the olfactory bulb, and they're probably going to have a panic attack. Folks, this happens in less than 1 second. What you're looking at here is one of the world's fastest supercomputers, if you will. It operates in nanoseconds. Every single one of you makes decisions about people that you meet every single day in under 1 second. There's a great TED Talk by Mark Bowden where he talks about how we put people into one of 4 categories. We either see people as friends, enemies, completely indifferent, or potential sexual partners. And what happens oftentimes is that most people we put into the indifferent category. We don't care. But what Bowden has found and other researchers is that when somebody is open, we tend to view them more as a friend. If we have prior information about that person, we may be more inclined to listen to them. If we see them as an enemy, if we see them as closed off, arms folded, looking down on us, we might not listen to them, or we might have negative experiences associated with them. If you look at a dog who completely trusts you, they'll lie down and be open. So one of the things that I encourage you to do, if you're not already back in seat, when you get to be in seat, or even if you're doing a Zoom lesson or a Google Meet lesson, is to spend time greeting kids. Research shows that when teachers stand outside of the classroom door and give kids fist bumps and greet them, the performance level of students go up. Detentions go down. Visits to school nurses go down. Attendance rates go up. A simple fist bump. And I know what you're all going to do when you get back from the Easter vacation and you see them, you're going to be like, hi. Your kids are going to be a little freaked out if you do that. So my invitation to you is just be a little bit more subtle than that. What we want in the classroom, believe it or not, is actually to get their limbic systems involved. We want that emotional component there. We want their excitement to be there, that dopamine level. Be keen on the dopamine. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this prefrontal cortex actually allows you what to process the information on an intellectual level. So people will oftentimes refer to this as the chief executive officer of the brain. That's responsible for planning, time management, organization, short-term memory, the ability to think about what it is that we're thinking, and teenagers just really aren't there yet. What research shows is that it's actually the last part of the brain to fully develop. If you go to my biography on the Cadence website, there'll be a link to free resources. And I'm also going to put this up onto that website that I send you to. But if you do want a PDF copy of this, you just email me. I'll bring up that information at the end of the presentation. One of the books that I love is by Sarah Jane Blakemore. She's a UK neuroscientist, did a great TED Talk a couple of years ago. In her book, what she's actually been able to identify is that for some people, we're seeing that the prefrontal cortex is not developed until their 4th and even 5th decade. So this idea that brain development stops at 25 may not necessarily be the truth. In full disclosure, folks, what I'm putting out to you today, 10 years from now might be a little bit different. What we know about the brain is kind of like taking a helicopter ride around Manhattan. The buildings are really big, but you don't know whether or not they're residential or commercial. And that's kind of where we're at with the brain science. So what we need to do for kids is actually show them how to do this, because one of the weakest connections in the brain is the connection between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. Judy Willis, a famous neuroscientist who actually went back to become a middle school teacher after being a neuroscientist, applies all of these neuroscientific principles and essentially says that, the emotional part of the brain is kind of like the gatekeeper for the prefrontal cortex. If the kids aren't engaged in your classroom, this information is not going to be processed appropriately. And another researcher, Abigail Baird from Vassar College, wanted to see what was going on in the brains of teenagers and adults, particularly with risk assessment. And she did this experiment called the no-brainer or good idea, bad idea. Again, similar to Yurgel and Todd, she put them and adults and teenagers into an fMRI machine and essentially said, you're going to look at a couple of things and you're going to tell me if this is a good idea or a bad idea. And like eating a salad, good idea. Spending time with a friend, good idea. Biting a light bulb, bad idea. Swimming with sharks, bad idea. The great thing is that both teenagers and adults said bad idea to the things that were very, very risky. But two very different things happened. Number one, the teens took longer to respond because they were thinking about it. Yes, thinking. Abigail Baird found that for teenagers, the part of the brain that was lit up was their prefrontal cortex. For the adults, their limbic system. In other words, they weren't necessarily thinking. As adults, somebody says, this is a good idea to play with the snake. No, bad idea. I didn't even need to think about it. You ask a teenager, hey, should you light your hair on fire? No. Now, that might be funny, but if you put them behind the wheel of a car, 3 seconds could be the difference between life and death. So they don't have the life experience yet to be able to make those split-second decisions. And when you have dopamine levels rising in teenagers, this is something also that impacts their ability to sort of process risks. For us, you ask an adult, hey, do you want to go skydiving? Oh, man, is there a life insurance policy? You ask a teenager what they think about, how much fun am I going to have and who's going to see it? Now, you throw this in there, many more people are going to see it. They're going to get many more likes. So, of course, they're going to do it. Of course, they're going to take risks. Folks, they're not stupid. It's just that their brains aren't yet fully developed. And speaking of dopamine, a really interesting experiment found that adolescent rats, when put into cages with other adult rats and other adolescent rats, will actually seek out other adolescent rats. When they are in the presence of adult rats, their dopamine levels go down. When they are in the presence of other adolescent rats, their dopamine levels go up. I want you all to put your arms out, give yourselves a big hug, and repeat after me. I am not cool. You're not. Not in their eyes, at least. You're not cool. You're an adult. You don't have the same levels of dopamine that they have. You don't do the exciting things that they do. Folks, in an office, you listen to light music in the background. You ever see a teenager with earbuds in there? They're totally into it. You put them into an MRI machine and put earbuds on. They have thousands of receptor sites light up. You put us into an MRI machine with music, we have a few hundred that light up. So no, we're not cool. But one of the things that we can do is to sort of ask them, well, what things are cool for you? To seem interested in them. All right, so one of the images I love to use for this idea of the prefrontal cortex is sort of like the United States. If you think about the United States before the interstate system was built, Eisenhower wasn't president. He was a young lieutenant colonel in the Army Corps of Engineers, and he traveled from D.C. to California, and it took him about 56 days to get there. Yes, 56 days, because there was one main road, the Lincoln Highway, and it wasn't even paved in certain parts. Now, you can go from Jersey to San Francisco on Route 80 in about 2 to 3 days, depending on how much coffee you drink. But you can get there a lot quicker. The land mass is still about the same. It's the same thing in terms of brain sizes between teenagers and adults. But one of the things that happens as we age is we lose the side roads and develop more interstates. See, we can multitask better. We can get from point A to point B much faster, but we don't have a lot of side roads. So when you tell your kid on the 5th time to take out the garbage, and they yell down, I'm doing it, they are in their minds because they had to check TikTok. They had to check Instagram. They looked out the window and whether or not they were going to be able to play this game. And then they thought about their friend and then, oh yeah, I have to do garbage. And then finally you yell for the 5th time. They don't have a lot of they don't have those interstates yet. We don't have a lot of the side roads. So what we need to do is we need to show them how to plan, how to manage their time. What we think oftentimes is that, the elementary schools are going to do it. And well, in elementary school, the parents are going to do it. And in high school, the middle school should have done it. And in high school and in college, actually in college, those are the ones who are doing it well. If you look at college counseling centers, they're the ones that have all of the details about how students can take notes, how they can study. So this needs to be a school-wide policy with them. There's a great video that I don't have time to show you, but it's by Thomas Frank, and it's called Study Less, Study Smart. It's in that resources packet that you'll be able to download. The last sort of thing that I want to mention is this idea of sleep. What we know from the National Sleep Foundation is that 20% of teenagers are getting 9 or more hours of sleep. And what the research shows is that they need about 9 hours and 15 minutes on a typical night to function optimally. Well, 60% are getting less than 8 hours. So what they do is they nap and they consume soda, Red Bull, all of these caffeinated beverages. And Judy Owens, the director of the Sleep Center at Children's National, she's also an adjunct up at Brown University, did a really interesting comparison of PET scans between kids who were clinically diagnosed with ADHD and those who were sleep deprived, and those brain scans essentially matched. So what I want to mention to you is just one more thing with regards to sleep, is that if your school starts very, very early, see if there's some way in which you can advocate for kids to get a little bit more sleep. All right, so some key takeaways. We are not cool. That's important. A walk and talk, this is important because as a result of their cortisol levels, when they get stressed out, it takes about 20 minutes for their cortisol levels to decrease. And what I have found is that talking with kids side to side oftentimes will help to de-escalate them. See, the head-on sort of discussion with them when you've asked them to leave the classroom because they're acting out may not necessarily work very well because they tend to get defensive. So walk with them, talk with them. For those of you who are parents, what you'll find is that actually driving with them, they may open up quite a bit. Always be curious. Remember, it's not personal. They will get there. Their brains just aren't there yet. We can help them. Be keen on the dopamine. Do fun things with them. Make learning exciting. Give them achievable challenges. You ever see them when you ask them, hey, does anybody know the answer to 2 + 2? Kid raises their hand. What is it? 4. And they're like, yes. So those small achievable challenges, that's a surge of dopamine. But if you ask them, a question that they may not necessarily, recall, what are the soteriological advantages of being a Christian? You're going to hear crickets in the classroom because that's a surge in cortisol. That's not what you want. If they have a strong reaction, or even adults, if we have a strong reaction, one of the best things I ever heard was, if someone's reaction is hysterical, it's historical. Great quote from John Maxwell: students don't care what you know until they know that you care. And one of my own is that sometimes the content of our students' lives is more important than the content of our lesson plan. Remember, all learning is emotional. It will be stored on an emotional level. Finally, these are ways in which you can contact me. I'm on social media. If you want immediately a copy of this presentation, please email me at consulted@terrencehoulihan.org. It's been a real pleasure spending time with you. If you have direct questions, you can also email me